Okay, guys, it is just a couple of minutes. There might be one or two people who come in, but thank you very much for coming down for the first in the 2017-18 Distinguished Lecture Series. This is obviously following on from last year, where we ran a social work lecture series, and we decided in the Department of Social Work, Care and Justice that the theme would be a social policy lecture series for this year. And there are a number of reasons for that. And I think one of the first ones, is that we're at a critical moment for social policy in the UK. And there's probably about three key events recently that have many consequences for British society. So if you think back to the financial crisis of 2008 and the subsequent direction that the UK government has taken in its policy since then, you've got Brexit and the vote to leave the European Union and the implications of that, and I think also the 2017 general election as one of those pivotal moments, potentially. So, the financial crisis in 2008 exposed the moral and the political bankruptcy of the neoliberal project that has guided approaches to social policy in the UK for the past 30 or 40 years. But since then, this has continued. More harsh austerity, cuts to support for disabled people, for social care, increasing social control of people claiming benefits and trying to get support through the welfare state. So Brexit, whatever your views on the European Union, the vote revealed huge divisions within society between the richest and the poorest, between different areas, between different ages. And so, it revealed the UK to be riven by division. And, Brexit is that one of those pivotal points, whether the UK remains a part of the European project, or whether it seeks some form of crony capitalist nationalism as a response, or indeed whether there is a social democratic alternative outside the EU. And finally, the 2017 general election. And I mention this because it was supposed to be the Brexit election. It was supposed to be the election that gave Theresa May this huge majority to have the authority to conduct the Brexit negotiations. But that didn't happen. It became an election about society and about those social issues that we face, the big issues of our time. And Aditya Chakraborty, the journalist for The Guardian, called it the first post-financial crisis election, where the reality of what's happened is starting to hit home. And so it was about those issues of precarity, inequality, insecurity, hunger, at appalling levels in a rich country such as the UK. So we thought that, with all these things, it was time to have a distinguished lecture series on these key issues of social policy today. And so we have, just to let you know, we have a programme of lectures over this academic year. Each of our speakers is a leader in their field of research, and we'll cover some of the burning issues of social policy. So obviously Professor Kate Pickett is here with us today to talk about inequality. We'll have the themes of healthcare, the NHS, poverty, citizenship and social security, power of corporations, and underlying all this, the future of the human race, the environment, and the problems of climate change. So as I say, all of our speakers across this series, and you're welcome to come to all the lectures throughout the year, are leaders in their field, and our speaker tonight is no exception. Kate Pickett is Professor of Epidemiology in the Department of Health Sciences at the University of York. She is a Fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, and is a leader in the fields of epidemiology, health inequalities, and the social determinants of health. She's a co-founder of the Equality Trust, and perhaps is best known for co-writing The Spirit Level with Richard Wilkinson, which was voted one of the top 10 books of the decade in the New Statesman, and is absolutely core reading for our social policy students, many of which who are here tonight. So I'll pass you on to Kate.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you everybody for coming this evening and giving up your time this evening to spend it with me talking about inequality. Inequality, it is an issue that's really taking centre stage worldwide as well as in the UK. And Oxfam, which used to be an organisation that entirely devoted itself to fighting poverty, is now engaged in a 10-year campaign to reduce inequality. And every year, Oxfam goes to the World Economic Forum at Davos and presents a report on inequality to them. And the first time it did this, a few years ago, this was the headline statistic in that report. They said that the 85 richest people on the planet own the same wealth as the 3.5 billion poorest, which is a shocking statistic. They got it slightly wrong. It turned out it was 60-something and not 88, so even worse than they had thought. Now, they've updated that figure every year, and this year, in 2017, this was their take-home statistic at Davos. We now have 8 billionaires who own the same wealth as the poorest 3.6 billion people. You could fit them all in that golf cart. So we have inequality on a world scale that is absolutely shocking, and people starting to pay attention to it. But it is a fairly recent political and policy phenomenon. And back in the early 2000s, people were not thinking about inequality. They weren't talking about inequality. Politicians weren't talking about it. It wasn't part of the public discourse. I can remember going up to Scotland and giving a talk on mine and Richard's research on the impact of inequality, and a member of the Scottish Parliament saying to me, "Oh, that's great stuff, that's really, really good." And I was thrilled, because I was a naive younger person then, and I said, "What are you going to do about it?" And he said, "Oh, nothing, nothing. We're not allowed to talk about inequality in New Labour." So there has been a real shift. Inequality is back on the agenda, and what I want to do tonight is discuss with you the impact that inequality has and why it is right that it is front and centre when we think about policy at a national level, at an international level, and at a local level, and indeed within our institutions like our universities. Stephen mentioned that I'm an epidemiologist, which is a bit of an obscure term. Epidemiologists study the distribution and the determinants of the health of populations. And we use statistics to do that. We are observational social scientists, so we look at determinants of health and well-being in populations and outcomes, and we look at that through a statistical lens. And what Richard and I found when we were writing our book, of course, is that lots of people don't like statistics. You know, they say if you put an equation in a book, you lose 10,000 readers, if you were ever lucky enough to get 10,000 in the first place. The only person who's ever really got away with having an equation in a best-selling book is Stephen Hawking, and that was just E equals mc squared. But anybody else shouldn't try it. But if you can understand this chart, you can understand really all of the statistical relationships I'm going to talk to you about and all of the other charts I'm going to show you. It's very, very simple. We find that health and social problems rise as income inequality rises. But before I take you through that evidence, I want to talk a little bit about why we came to study income inequality. So I thought I'd start with this picture. So this is a picture taken outside Oxford Street Tube Station on a weekday morning, a work day morning. So here are people commuting to work. So they're all employed, they're all young, they're probably healthy, and they are thoroughly miserable. So there's not a smile on a face. Some of them look rather angry, some of them look rather upset, some of them look bored, some of them look as if they're about to cry. There's quite a lot of misery evident there and not a lot of joy. And in a way, this exemplifies the problem we were trying to grapple with, because we live in a world in which, for the most part, we have unprecedented levels of material comfort. Most of us live in warm houses, most of us have enough to eat, lots of us are employed, we have labor-saving devices. And if you asked any of our grandparents, great-grandparents, what they would have thought life would be like at this level of material comfort, I think they would have expected that we'd be living in some kind of paradise, given the hard work and labor that they had to do just to have sufficient amounts of things, or even often insufficient amounts of things. And yet, we have this paradox of this material comfort and this psychosocial dysfunction and distress. So in part, we were trying to understand what is it that affects quality of life in our modern contemporary societies in the rich, developed world. And also informing that was our understanding of this picture. So what we're looking at here is life expectancy in lots of different countries. So up the side, we've got life expectancy at birth for men and women in lots of different countries. So it ranges from about 40 in some countries up to over 80 in others, around 80. And the life expectancy for each country is plotted against a measure of gross domestic product per capita, and these are all made to be equivalent. So you can think of this measure as really the sort of standard of living, a level of the material standards of life in different societies. And what you can see, and it doesn't really matter if you can read any of those country names or not, but that in the early stages of economic development, over on the left, as countries become a little bit richer, as the standard of living improves, life expectancy improves very rapidly. But once you get beyond a certain level of economic development, then that relationship, that association between standards of living and life expectancy is lost. So once you get beyond a certain point, countries can get richer and richer and richer, out along here to the right, but it doesn't affect life expectancy. So in the rich, developed world, we seem to have come to the end of what economic growth can do for us in terms of population health. And if we looked at levels of happiness in relation to GDP per capita, we see exactly the same curve, or life satisfaction, quality of life. So if it's not economic growth, what is it that is providing us with quality of life and better health? Now, I just want to show you the rich developed countries on their own, without the low, middle income and developing countries. So again, we're looking at life expectancy up the side, but because these are wealthier countries with high life expectancy, we're going only from about 75 up to 80. We're now looking against a measure of gross national income per head, so it's the same kind of thing, per capita income, standards of living. And you can see that the two richest countries among these rich developed countries, Norway and the USA, have similar levels of income per person, but very different life expectancies. And the same at the poorer end if you contrast Israel and Portugal. Similar income per head and very different life expectancies. There's no relationship at all between income per person and life expectancy in the rich countries. And yet most of you will know that in every single one of those countries, income is related to health. Health is worse among the poor than it is among the rich. Here's what it looks like within a country. We've got life expectancy again going from about 70 up to 80 years. And these are data for local neighbourhoods in England and Wales. These are quite old, so life expectancy has improved for everybody since we measured this. But the pattern has stayed exactly the same. And when these data were collected, if you lived in the richest neighbourhoods in England and Wales, you had an average life expectancy of just over 79 years, but if you lived in the poorest neighborhoods, it was, 71 and a half. So a big gap in life expectancy between the richest and the poorest. We still have that today in many areas. It's growing. And some of you may have seen those wonderful maps that public health observatories sometimes produce that show if you get on the Jubilee tube line in London, in Westminster, and travel out to the east to Canning Town, you lose a year of life expectancy for every stop along that line. I've seen similar maps for bus journeys through Sheffield, from the affluent outskirts, losing life expectancy into the middle, and then gaining it again as they go out. I've seen it for Glasgow, the New York subway. Those are powerful representations of this gap between the rich and the poor. But what I want you to really focus on here is the gradient. So if you live in the second most affluent neighbourhoods in England and Wales, your life expectancy is quite high, but it's not as high as the people in the very richest neighbourhoods. And this gradient in health is almost ubiquitous. You see it for every kind of health outcome. You see it for every kind of way of dividing up society. You see it all over the world. And that tells you that it isn't the income itself that matters or what it materially buys for you. Those people in that second most affluent set of neighborhoods, they can afford to buy everything that you might think of that purchases health, whether it's going to the gym, a very good diet, a very comfortable life, etc. So it's not just a difference between rich and poor, it is a gradient. And it's relative income that matters, and what your income tells you about where you stand in society. So the social gradient forces us to think about psychosocial explanations of health rather than focusing on material ones. The gap between rich and poor is very important, but the gradient itself is extremely important because it changes the way we need to think about the health differences between us and the determinants of our health. So Richard and I started investigating the impact of that gap between rich and poor on health and well-being. We wondered what happens to health and well-being when the social ladder gets steeper, when that gradient gets steeper and the rungs get pulled further apart and there's more distance between the rich and the poor. And we made an index of health and social problems. So what we were looking for to put into that index were problems that have got that social gradient. So they're worse at the bottom of society, but there is a gradient all the way up. We were looking for problems for which we could get very good data from different countries, so we could be sure that the measurements were good. And we put them all into an index. So we've got health measures in that index. We've got life expectancy, we've got infant mortality, we've got obesity, we've got mental health. But we've also got measures of what society is like to live in, the relationships between people. So we've got trust, and we've got homicide rates, and we've got imprisonment. And then we've also got measures of what it's like for young people to develop in that society. So what economists horribly call human capital development, but the rest of us all just think of as children's life chances or trajectories. So we've got how well kids do in school, whether or not young women become teenage mothers, and we've got a measure of social mobility. We've weighted them all equally because we have no reason to think that one is a worse problem than any of the others. You could argue with that if you like, and we could produce weighted indices. But we created that measure for the rich, developed, large countries. These are all market economies. And we looked to see how they performed on that measure of health and social problems in relation to a measure of the gap between the rich and the poor. And this is what we found. And it's an astonishingly close correlation. It's really rare to find something like this in social sciences. It looks a bit more like a physics experiment that you do in high school with a Bunsen burner and a chemical reaction or something. If you know a country's level of income inequality, you can predict its level of these health and social problems with great accuracy. So at the more equal end, we've got Japan and the Scandinavian countries. with very low levels of inequality, the lowest in the world for rich developed nations, with low levels of health and social problems. And at the more unequal end, you've got the USA, Portugal, and the UK, doing much worse and much more unequal. Now, we knew when we published this that it would be controversial. Inequality is a politically sensitive issue. People have ideological positions about inequality. There's a big difference between the left and the right on how they feel and think about inequality. And we knew that some people would think we'd just chosen these countries to suit our argument. And indeed, some people would look at it and say, oh, it's all cultural. It's just to do with the different cultures in those countries. It's not inequality. It's the Scandinavian countries. They're just weird. Right? They're different to us. They are different to us. Better in lots of ways. Or there's something really sort of nasty about the English-speaking countries, and we're just a bit worse than everybody else. But you can take the English-speaking countries off this graph. You can take the Scandinavian countries off this graph, and you've still got a statistically significant correlation between health and social problems and inequality. And of course, we've got Japan down there at the equal end, which is nothing like the Scandinavian countries. And we've got Portugal doing poorly and Spain doing okay, who are culturally very, very similar. But just to sort of clinch this argument that it's not to do with these national differences in how countries are, we repeated the whole thing with the US states. So sort of a different test bed. So we created the same index of health and social problems, and we looked at it in relation to income inequality within each of those 50 states. It's not as tight a correlation, so other factors are affecting those health and social problems, but it is a statistically significant one. It's not due to chance alone. The more unequal states up there, we've got Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, have more health and social problems and more inequality than Utah, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, Iowa, down at the bottom. And just to be really sure that it wasn't our choice of health and social problems that was driving this, we did it all again with somebody else's index of well-being. And we chose the UNICEF Index of Child Well-being in Rich Countries, which UNICEF first produced in 2007. And some of you may remember when that report first came out, because the UK came bottom. We have the worst child well-being in that 2007 report of all rich countries. And usually we can at least look at the USA and say they're doing worse than we are. But on this one, no. We came bottom. And we came bottom on sort of almost every measure that's in that index. And there are 40 measures in that index. And we're really bad at lots of them. We're very good at preventing traffic accidents in our young people, and that's about all we're good at. We came spectacularly low on binge drinking, our kids having sex before the age of 15, and our kids not finding their peers kind and helpful. Those were the areas where we scored worst of all. But again, we can see that this index, which contains everything from whether or not kids eat their fruits and vegetables, whether they can talk to their parents, whether they've been immunized, whether they've got books at home, all sorts of things, is related to inequality, and the more equal countries have higher levels of child well-being. Now, because UNICEF has continued to produce this index over a number of different reports, we've also recently been able to look at change in income inequality in relation to change in child well-being. And this is important because if you want to infer that something is a causal relationship, then it's very, very helpful to see that if something changes, the inequality changes, then the outcome changes. If I had a pound for every time somebody had said to me, correlation does not prove causation, I would be in the top 1%, and you would all be wanting to tax me more, and I would be part of the inequality problem rather than hopefully part of the solution. Correlation does not prove causality. However, that doesn't mean that you're not seeing causality when you see a correlation. But here, we're looking at changes in inequality measured by the Gini coefficient. Don't worry what that means. Over on the left, we've got countries becoming more equal over the decade from 2000 to 2009. some countries over here becoming less equal, and we're looking at change in that index in child well-being. And I often here draw attention to Sweden, which has the fastest growing inequality among the OECD countries and has seen a decline in its child well-being exactly as we would predict from that change in inequality. They're still doing better. This is change, not absolute levels of well-being, but they're getting worse and fast. Okay, I'm going to move on, just show you a few of those individual health and social outcomes in relation to inequality. Really, to get across to you, I think, the scale of the differences. So here we're looking at mental illness. And these data come from surveys from the World Health Organization, from an effort that was set up to provide comparable data on the prevalence of mental illness in different countries. And people used to think, you couldn't really compare mental illness in different countries because health systems are different, so treatments are different, stigma of mental illness is different, so people might be less likely to go. But these data come from population-based surveys of random samples of adults, and they're asked about symptoms, not whether they've been treated or been to a doctor or been told they've got a diagnosis. And then those symptoms are clustered into illnesses. In the more equal countries, Japan, Belgium, Germany, on here, and we don't have these surveys for a vast number of countries, but for those that we do, the more equal ones, about 10 adults out of every 100 have had some kind of mental illness in the past year. In Australia and the UK, 23% of us, and in the USA, 26%, so more than a quarter. So we've got, 2.5 times as much mental illness in the more unequal countries compared to the more equal ones. That's a big difference in relation to inequality. If we look at imprisonment rates, the effects are even more dramatic. So here we're looking at the number of prisoners per 100,000 people in the population in different countries. And this one is on a log scale, okay? So for those of you who, like me, don't really like mathematics and have forgotten all you ever learned at O-level, and that shows how old I am, all that means is that the difference on this scale up the side between 10 and 100 is the same as between 100 and 1,000. And the reason this is on a log scale is because otherwise we couldn't fit the USA on here, right? It would be, I know, up there somewhere. Among the more equal countries here, about 50 prisoners per 100,000 population, and I think it's 686 in the USA. So vast differences. I think that's a 16-fold difference. And once again, if you know a country's level of income inequality, you can predict its level of imprisonment, apart from Greece. You can ask me about that in the questions if you like. Now, this is not closely related to crime rates. Imprisonment rates are not primarily driven by crime rates. To some extent they are, but not primarily. What they're driven by is how harsh the judicial system is in different places. So whether or not you send somebody to prison for a particular crime or give them a community sentence, how long you send them away for, how likely they are to come back into prison after they've been released. And we have looked fairly recently at the age at which children are considered criminally responsible in different countries, and that's related to inequality as well. So you're more likely to consider younger children to be responsible for their crimes in a more unequal society. And here's social mobility. These data come from an American researcher, Korak, in a World Bank report. And he includes more countries than we usually look at. The reason we restricted our analysis to the rich developed nations is because those are the ones where we don't need economic growth anymore. He's looking at a broader set of countries. And he's looking at social mobility. Now, this is something that across the political spectrum, people will agree is a good thing, right? Children should have equal life chances. Equality of opportunity is something that everybody agrees should happen. And this measure of social mobility tends to look at what children's incomes are like when they become adults in comparison to what their parents' incomes were, to see if rich parents have kids who stay rich, or if there's social mobility, if poor children can move up, etc. Among the rich developed countries, we've got the United States, often thought of as the land of opportunity, with the lowest social mobility of all, and the highest social mobility, again, in the Nordic countries and in Canada. So we sometimes say that if you want to live the American dream, you should go to Denmark. You've got far more chance of doing that there. Okay. So inequality is related to a large range of health and social problems, and that evidence base keeps growing. New papers keep being published, linking inequality to different kinds of problems. I saw one on mass shootings a couple of weeks ago. It's also, inequality seems to have large effects on the different levels of these problems in different societies, but the third notable thing is that it appears to affect the whole society. So it doesn't just affect the poor at the bottom. The effects of inequality are felt by the whole population. And to be able to demonstrate that, you need to be able to compare people in different countries or different societies at the same socioeconomic position, which is quite tricky to do, and that's why we don't have a huge number of studies that show that. But when we do have studies that are able to do that, we get this sort of fanning out effect, and I'll explain it. So what we're looking at here are literacy scores for young adults. So how literate, how well young adults are scoring in Sweden, which is very equal, in the United States, which is very unequal, and Canada, whose inequality is about in the middle of the two. And we're looking at the young people's scores in relation to the number of years of education their parents have had. In Sweden, everybody scores quite high. The social gradient is quite shallow. Poor children, or children whose parents have less education, who are probably poor, they don't do as well as those whose parents have had lots of education, but there's not much difference. The gap, the inequality, the gradient is steeper, and they're further apart in the more unequal United States, and Canada about in the middle. So even if your parents are among the highest educated kinds of parents in the United States, your educational scores on average will be lower than if you had the same kind of parents and you lived in Sweden. So this fanning out effect is very common for health, for other measures. The inequality seems to have the greatest impact among those at the bottom of society, but it affects everybody. So much so that our colleagues at Harvard University refer to income inequality as a social pollutant, because like air pollution, it affects all of us. So inequality bad, inequality has big effects, and inequality affects everybody. I want to turn now to what inequality does to social relationships, because I think in a way this is at the root of things. And what inequality does to the relationships between us is both sort of profound and disturbing, and it has knock-on effects on all kinds of other things. So here we have trust. Now we have levels of trust in different countries, and the data come from the World Values Survey, where random samples of the population are asked, do you think most people can be trusted or not? So it's not whether or not you trust the police or politicians or journalists or academics or experts or whatever. It's do you trust just other people? So this measure of generalized trust is a key component of sort of social capital, and it varies a lot between countries. So in the more equal ones, we see about 2/3 of the population feeling that others can be trusted, and in the more unequal ones, it's down to less than 1/5. And we think this probably affects every single interaction that any of us have with other people as we live our lives. So if you're a woman walking home alone at night, this will affect how you feel about that activity. If you're a young man walking down the street, and you see a cluster of other young men on a street corner, how you feel that interaction might go. What relationships are like in workplaces, on public transport, on the school playground. So every aspect of our life may be affected by this willingness to feel that other people can be trusted or not. And for those of you who've lived and traveled in different countries, you feel this in different places. That level of trust also permeates how involved people feel in the society they live in. And here we see that civic participation is related to inequality. So in the more equal countries, people are more likely to vote, they're more likely to belong to community organizations or trade unions or political organizations or even read newspapers, etc. So civic participation is higher in more equal places, and that's critical for democracy. And much of what we see around our politics in Britain today is probably being driven hard by our levels of inequality. Disengagement with politics, feeling that the democratic process isn't something for you, feeling that you cannot affect change. And trust and how you feel about other people in society affects levels of violence. So here we've got the murder rate from Canadian colleagues, and they're giving it for Canadian provinces, which are the little blue triangles, and American states, which are the red dots. And we're looking at murders per million people per year. There are about 15 murders per million people per year in the most equal Canadian provinces, and about 150 in the more unequal US states. So tenfold differences in the murder rate across the states and provinces, closely correlated with income inequality. And the most common trigger to this kind of violence is lack of respect and people feeling looked down upon, and that they're in an encounter, that they are being disrespected. There are countries that are a lot more unequal than the rich developed nations that we tend to study. And in those highly unequal societies, you see the impact of this loss of trust and rising violence written on the landscape, the urban landscape of where people live. We took this picture in Cuernavaca in Mexico, and this is just very typical of an ordinary house on an ordinary residential street where you've got bars with spikes on, and you've got razor wire in rolls around the top, and you're frightened of your neighbors and you're frightened of people on the street. And so people are barricaded within their households from each other. The American equivalent of that is the gated community, where you isolate yourself and have a gate and a security guard, etc. And it can get worse than Mexico. We took this picture in South Africa, where you've still got the spikes on the gates, but you haven't got razor wire up there anymore. You've got an electric fence, in case anybody tries it on. If they manage to get over, someone will come and shoot them. This is armed response, so an armed person will come and shoot you. And if that doesn't work, there are, fuzzy, I know, 2 very large dogs lingering at the back of the driveway. But again, this is a typical residential street in South Africa, and you see this defensiveness, this level of needing to protect yourself from other citizens going along with greater inequality. And it's reflected in this chart. This one shows, this comes from Canadian economists, that the percentage of the workforce that's employed in what are called protective services or guard labor rises with inequality. And the 2 dots at the very top right are the United States in 1979 and then the United States in 2000, showing how much that increased as that inequality increased. So this is the proportion of the workforce that are police or private security guards or engaged in guard labor of some kind. So people who are employed to protect other people from different people. We're looking for an internationally comparable measure of the percentage of lawyers in the population as well, because that has to go along with inequality. Right, so I want to spend a bit of time now on why inequality affects us as it appears so much. You know, if these are true causal relationships, and we believe they are for lots of reasons, which I can talk to you about in question time if you want, and which we've published on, why are we so deeply affected by the hierarchical structure of our societies, by how far the gap is between the rich and the poor? How does it change the way we feel and behave and act and our health and all of those things? And one key perspective here comes from this paper by, I think it's Robin Walker, and I haven't put it up there so you can read it or test your eyesight. I've just put it up there to remind me to talk to you about it. And what Walker and his colleagues did was they studied poverty in lots of different societies around the world, both rich ones and poor ones. And they talked to poor people in all of those different countries. They talked to people in Pakistan, they talked to people in Norway, they talked to people in the UK, etc., etc. And the material conditions in which poor people lived in those different societies were really different. So if you were a poor person in Norway, you were typically living in a 3-bedroomed house with central heating and had a car, etc., etc. If you were a poor family in Pakistan, you didn't have anything other than an earth floor, you didn't have sanitation in the house, didn't have electricity, etc. But what they found was that the experience of poverty was the same everywhere. So if you talk to people about what it felt like to be poor, they felt the same, whether they were poor in Norway or poor in Pakistan or poor in the UK or poor in Africa. And what they felt was shame. They felt that they had failed. They felt that they had failed their families. They felt embarrassed. They felt they weren't good enough. And they report this in quite emotional terms. They report that sometimes there's domestic violence because men feel they've let their families down, really, and that's the only outlet they have. They talk about how schools make poor children feel like second-class citizens and not worth teaching. So the experience of poverty is the same everywhere. And so that leads us to the question of, does it feel worse to think about your status in more unequal societies compared to less equal societies? No, sorry, I got that wrong, didn't I? More unequal societies compared to more equal societies. Does status matter more? Does your relative social position matter more? Is it more salient? Does it mean more? And when we were writing the Spirit level, our thinking about that was being driven by the experimental work that psychologists do around understanding what makes us feel stressed. Are there any psychologists here? A lone psychologist. You do really nasty things to people as a profession to learn the important insights you learn. Usually it's school or college students, who get paid to do various experiments. And we do learn very important things that way. One of the things that psychologists across the world have been really interested in is what kind of things most reliably cause us stress. And Dickerson and Kemeny, who are psychologists from California, did what we call a meta-analysis, so grouping the results of lots and lots of studies. I think they had 172 studies in their analysis of experiments where psychologists had brought subjects into an experimental laboratory and given them stressful things to do and then measured their stress hormone responses. And what they were trying to understand was what kinds of tasks most reliably cause us stress. And it turns out to be tasks with what they call social evaluative threat. And that is tasks where other people have the chance to judge you negatively. That is what causes us stress. So if I gave you all some difficult mathematics problems to do, some of you wouldn't mind, some of you might even enjoy them, some of you would hate it, but you wouldn't any of you be that stressed. But if I made you read out your marks to the entire lecture theatre, that would be more stressful. Public speaking is like the number one stressful thing. So if we measured everybody's stress hormones right now, yours would all be fine, and mine would be off the chart. Because the only person in this room whom everybody has got a chance to judge negatively is me. To me, you're just a sea of nice, friendly faces, but, you know, I'm much more vulnerable. So it's tasks that make us feel exposed to the views of others. And that's because we see ourselves, we judge ourselves through other people's eyes. Our stress biology is really well understood now. So if we're constantly exposed to chronic stress, we know what profound effects it has on health, on our immune systems, our reproductive systems, on our cardiovascular systems, on our neurological systems as well. So this source of this social evaluative threat source of stress may be worse in societies where status is more important. So it matters more what people think of your status. And we were also struck by this study, which shows that what other people, how you perceive other people thinking about you, not only affects your body, your physiology, your biology, but it affects your cognition, the way you think and perform as well. And in this study, from researchers at the World Bank, they brought Indian schoolboys into a classroom setting, and the test that they asked them to perform was to solve a number of puzzles in a given time. And they were those maze puzzles where you find your way from the outside, you know, into the middle. How many could they do in a given time? They had boys from high caste families, those are the blue bars, and from low caste families, the sort of reddish, purpley bars. And when the boys didn't know each other's caste, they performed equally well on this task. But after they'd had to go around the room and announce their caste to the class, then the performance of the low caste boys declined, and they couldn't complete as many puzzles in the time. This is a very widely demonstrated phenomenon now. So in America, lots of studies of African American and white high school and college students being given tests. Just give them a test, they do equally well. Tell them it's an intelligence test, and that provokes the stereotype that the black students worry about, how they're seen in society, and they do less well. Psychologists call this stereotype threat. Women are affected by it. So if you give us tests of maths and spatial ability, we're just as good as the guys, unless you tell us before we do that test that science has shown that they are better at it than we are. And then we don't do as well. In fact, we are so sensitive to gender stereotype threats that if you put boxes at the top of a test where women have to tick male or female, they do worse than if they don't have to tick those boxes. And there are similar studies by social class. But really, when we wrote the spirit level, we were relying on these kinds of experiments to inform our thinking, to allow us to sort of make an inference from all of those correlations I've shown you to thinking about what the causes might be. And our theory was that its anxiety about status gets heightened in more unequal countries, and that's what causes all the health and social problems. But I can remember going back to the University of Chicago, where I used to teach, and presenting this to my former colleagues, and they were very unimpressed. They're unimpressed with everybody, actually. It's a really quite a socially evaluative threat environment for everybody. But they basically said at the end of my talk, well, you think it's status anxiety, but you've not shown us that. Well, luckily, somebody else now has. And this study, published in 2014 by Late and Whelan, looked at status anxiety explicitly in different countries in relation to income inequality. And they're looking here at 28 European countries. And I will say here that one of the truly sad consequences of Brexit could be the consequence that we no longer take part in European data collection efforts. And EU standardized data collection has been a boon for social scientists. It really has. So that's an anxiety, quite apart from our status anxiety. But they're looking at status anxiety in different countries. The top line are high inequality European countries. The bottom line are the low inequality European countries. And they're looking at across the income scale. So they look at status anxiety among the poorest tenth of the population all the way up to the richest tenth. And although you're less anxious about your status if you're rich compared to if you're poor everywhere, all the population is affected by inequality. So even among the richest tenth of the population, there's more anxiety about status in high inequality countries compared to low inequality countries. So that has been a useful confirmation of what we thought was going on. And now we've got to the point where we think there are really three kinds of different ways in which we as individuals respond to greater inequality, to living in a more hierarchical society, to living in a society where the social pyramid looks like this rather than like that. And the first of those responses is to respond to that threatened social evaluative threat, those stereotypes, those worries about status, and become depressed and anxious. And we do see studies now coming out that are looking at levels of depression in different places. These are US states, and finding that depression is higher in more unequal countries. But we have a number of studies that look like that. So that's one way that we as individuals can kind of deal with a very unequal society. We sort of withdraw. We stop competing, and levels of depression rise. But some people have the opposite response to inequality, and they sort of strive harder. And they're more likely to try and put on a good front to show that they're not affected by the status anxiety. And we first got a clue about this when we were looking at studies of income inequality and health, and it was clear that the studies that looked at self-rated health, rather than things like life expectancy or mortality rates, which are objective measures, showed something very different. There wasn't a relationship between health and inequality if you looked at self-rated health rather than objective measures. And here, the reason for that becomes very clear. So do you remember on those other charts earlier, we had Japan had the highest life expectancy in the world, 82 in this table, this is in the top line, but only 54% of the Japanese population say their health is good, if you ask them. Whereas in the country with the lowest life expectancy on this table, the USA, where it's down at 77 years, 80% of people say their health is good. So there's clearly a mismatch between objective measures of health and subjective measures of health when you compare different populations. And that made us wonder whether or not, if you're living in a more unequal society where status matters more, it's more important to put on a good face and say you're okay. And it turns out that that is true. Now, many of you may have heard of what's called the Lake Wobegon effect, which comes from an American radio show where all the children are above average. That's how they describe Lake Wobegon. If you ask Americans whether they are better drivers than average, 96% of them say they are. Okay? Which can't be right. In Sweden, 66% of people think they're better drivers than average. Still isn't right, but it's closer to what should be right. And it turns out that this is a general phenomenon. And when you look at what's called self-enhancement, people's likelihood to self-enhance, it is related to income inequality. So this study from 2011 from Luffman and his colleagues is looking at that tendency to self-enhance in different countries in relation to a measure of inequality. And self-enhancement here against random samples of the population, and they're being asked, Are you more intelligent than other people? Do you think you're better looking than other people? Do you think you're nicer than other people? Are you a better driver, etc., etc.? And you're more likely to big yourself up in that way in a more unequal society. So that seems to be a second response. And we can see it reflected in the rise of narcissism over time in the United States, which tracks the rise in income inequality quite nicely. We haven't been measuring narcissism at population levels for very long because we didn't used to know how to separate it out from self-esteem. Now we do. You can't use the Rosenberg measure of self-esteem in the United States anymore with college students. They just all score at the top. But if you separate out realistic self-esteem from narcissism, you can see there's a mismatch. If you want to find out if you're a narcissist, you can log on to the internet and take the Narcissistic Personality Inventory. I think it's 20 questions. They come in pairs. I did that. And there's one question that says, do you think the world would be a better place if you were in charge? And I thought, yeah, I do. There's one or two things I'd do right away, and they would really help. But then luckily, the paired one that goes with that says, I'd be quite frightened if I had to be in charge of the world. I mean, it's not a great inventory. Some of the questions are quite hard to answer. There's one that says, I love to look in the mirror versus I don't like looking in the mirror. Well, it depends, doesn't it? Good hair day, mirror. Bad hair day, don't want to. But it has some validity with psychiatric assessments. And certainly this rise over time is very striking. And narcissism is something that, if an individual is suffering from narcissism, that has profound effects on their friends, their families, their colleagues, and they're not narcissistic because they are better than other people. They're not outperforming anybody else. So when faced with inequality, you can go under with depression, or you can fight your way up with self-enhancement or narcissism, or you can take the third way, and that's all of the things that all of us do to feel better when we're feeling threatened or worried. And that's more alcohol consumption, more drug use, more comfort eating, and here we're showing more gambling. And more shopping, more compulsive shopping. All of the things that people do to feel better about themselves, those rise with greater inequality as well. Right, I'm trotting now towards the last few fences, and I will try to leap them quickly so we have lots of time for questions. As epidemiologists, Richard and I have really focused on the health and these social relationship kinds of outcomes, the psychosocial and health impact of inequality. But lots of other researchers are looking at other effects of inequality as well, and asking the question about what happens when societies become more materialistic and individualistic. That's what happens. We buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like, who everybody who's younger than me in this audience will know comes from the movie Fight Club. I had to be told that by my children, having thought it was a profound philosophical kind of statement. But when we're threatened by, that when we're worried about our status, how do we show our status? We buy things that show our status. You can buy a Louis Vuitton trash bag to put your rubbish out if you're really worried about your status. You want people to think you're really good. And you can go on eBay and you can buy used designer carrier bags so that you can go shopping in Primark and pop your little goodie into a Gucci paper bag that somebody else got with their purchase. But we're now getting the empirical studies, the research studies that show that consumerism and overconsumption are related to inequality. So in more unequal areas of the USA, people are more likely to buy high-status cars. They're more likely to be searching on the internet for status goods. These kinds of studies are growing and growing. We also have a lot of studies in psychology that show consumerism and overconsumption doesn't make people happy. And environmental colleagues and geographers, Danny Dorling is a geographer at the University of Oxford, are showing how inequality relates to resource use. So this is water consumption is higher in more unequal societies. He's shown it for meat consumption. the number of flight miles that people get per year. I like this one because it's trips by bicycle. You know, people are more likely to engage in environmentally friendly behaviors in more equal societies, especially in the Netherlands. They recycle more, you know, so more equal countries do better on an average measure of recycling. Their business leaders think that their governments should comply with environmental regulations, and their carbon emissions are lower. So in all kinds of ways that measure sustainability and our transition to sustainable economies, inequality is a roadblock. It's going to get in the way of us making that transition because it drives status consumption, overconsumption, and consumerism. It's related internationally to biodiversity through monoagriculture and land grabs. So it's really bad. Right. I'm going to finish up just with a few thoughts on what we can do about inequality. It has been rising in most countries since the late 1970s, early 80s. This is the neoliberal drive towards inequality. We are now at levels of inequality in the UK that we haven't seen since the Edwardian era, and then, or certainly the 1920s. So countries have become much, much more unequal. And at least people are starting to talk about it. So we have Christine Lagarde at the International Monetary Fund. We had Barack Obama when he was still president. I don't suppose the current president of the US would have anything good to say about reducing inequality, but never mind. The Pope, we've got the UN Secretary General. Recognizing that we have an inequality problem is the first step to dealing with it. So that transition from saying, oh, we can't talk about inequality in New Labour, to being able to have a public and political discussion is key. And the population wants more equality. So in the British Social Attitude Survey, year after year after year after year, people say they want society to be more equal, even though they underestimate how unequal it is. And these are data from an American study that's similar. In the top line, in the top bar is the actual distribution of wealth, and that yellow bit is the richest fifth, the wealthiest fifth, having about 80% of the wealth. That's the actual situation in America. And the poorest fifth have got nothing. Americans think it is the middle bar. They think that the wealthiest fifth have actually got, close to 60%. And what they'd like it to be is the bottom one. 92% of Americans said they wanted the bottom income distribution and not the middle or the top one. And that was whether they were Republican or Democrat, African American, white or Latino, whether they were men, whether they were women, whether they were religious, whether they were not, whether they were young, and whether they were old. 92%. And that distribution was Sweden's. So 92% of Americans would actually like to be Swedish. Now, when you've got that level of population desire, that's a strong mandate. And when you've got international leaders talking about inequality, then you're opening up some space for some action. And we've got an international framework for sustainable development up to 2030 that includes reducing inequalities within and between countries as goal number 10. So we've got the public, and we've got the world leaders, and we've got the framework. We have a choice about how we do it. We can do it by reducing income differences before tax, so making income differences smaller, or we can do it through tax and benefit system. The danger with doing it through taxes and benefits is you can get a very progressive tax system set up, and then the next government comes in and changes it with a stroke of a pencil. So we had our top tax rate go up in the UK under the last Labour government. Didn't seem to bother anybody, but as soon as we got the coalition government in, it went down again. Richard and I are really starting to think and believe and write a lot about the value of increasing economic democracy in all ways as a way of getting a greater culture of equality more deeply embedded in our institutions. So that is trade unions, workers' cooperatives, employee share ownership, employees on company boards, particularly on remuneration committees. So it's everything that provides a bit of democracy and a bit of sunlight into the places where incomes are set. And if we taxed well, we could do an awful lot. And if we shut down tax havens, we could afford all of the kinds of social policies we might like to put in place. The Equality Trust estimated that just last year, so just 12 months, increased wealth by our richest 1,000 people in Britain would pay our entire adult social care bill for 4 years. And we used to have a 90% tax rate on very, very high incomes. If we did that again, we could pay for an awful lot of things. Japan and Sweden get their greater equality in very different ways. Sweden does it through that redistribution, the taxes and the benefits, and Japan does it through having the smaller income differences in the first place. And you saw how well they both do on health and social problems. It doesn't matter how you get your greater equality, it just matters that you get there. I think I'm going to skip these on pay and end with this one. If you don't pay attention to your inequality, you are taking a great risk. And this last graph that I'm going to show you comes from The Economist, which is not known for its progressive viewpoint. And they were responding to a Twitter challenge that asked, what factor most closely correlates with the swing to Trump in the US presidential election, the swing from the Republicans to the Democrats? And the factor that they found, they're looking at US counties here, there are about 3,000 US counties, and they're quite small. The factor that they found that most strongly predicted that swing to Donald Trump was a population health measure that included the percentage of the population that were obese, had diabetes, were heavy drinkers, didn't exercise, and had low life expectancy. We know how strongly that's related to inequality. We know that those are the people who are about to have their health insurance taken away by the president they were voting in. But when you leave people behind in society, when you reduce their feeling of being included, when you value some people much, much more than others, then you risk that alienation, social isolation, anger that drives populism, far-right movements, and is very, very destructive to democracy. So inequality matters to every one of us, matters all over the world. We know the damage it does, and we know what kinds of solutions we can take. And back when the neoliberal agenda got started, if you were Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan, which is quite an unpleasant thought, isn't it? Don't know which is worse, really. But if you were them or their advisors, you could genuinely believe that what you were about to pursue, that neoliberal ideology, was going to be the economic tide that lifted all boats, that trickle-down economics would happen, that would have rapid growth, that would make everybody better off. You could believe that because you hadn't tried it and you didn't know different. But now we know. Well, now we know that didn't work. Well, now we know it caused rising inequality. Now we know the damage that that inequality does. So if we continue on that pathway, we're being both ignorant and immoral because we have the evidence to do things differently. So I'm going to stop there and hope we're going to have some good questions. Thanks. Oh yeah, I'll put that there.
Thank you very much, Kate, for that fantastic, fascinating talk there. Are there any questions then?
Richard. Hi. Thanks very much for that sort of somewhat depressing but extremely important sort of range of statistics and things that you've talked us through. I suppose the question is given the pretty much insurmountable evidence around the social and economic cost of inequality, why do we not have more redistributive policies? You could argue, in a sense, that the people who are most influenced, the most powerful policy actors, have it in their best interest not to be. But what would you say?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, the more unequal a society, the more it's dominated by an elite, and often one that relies on, the intergenerational perpetuation of inequality. So you're not going to get the turkeys voting for Christmas, unlike in the US with people voting against their best interests. I think it's really hard. I don't expect it to be an easy transition. We haven't had all this evidence for very long, and social change can happen quite quickly. So I'm not pessimistic despite all of this. So, the changes that we've seen in civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, for example, over the past half century, are astonishingly profound and large. And those changes came about not because some elite or some government gave them to people, but because people demanded them. Grassroots movements changed public opinion. When public opinion shifts, then politicians follow. I hope that in time it will be as embarrassing to be seen to be greedy and grasping and out for yourself as it is generally these days to be seen to be racist or misogynist or homophobic or whatever. And part of that is public education and showing people. And that's not an easy task, and it's certainly not one that academics are good at. We write our peer-reviewed papers and nobody reads them. Our students don't read them, our colleagues don't read them. My mum doesn't even read mine anymore. If you write a book like we wrote, you reach some more people, but still a tiny, tiny percentage of people. If you write in a newspaper, you reach quite a lot more. If you do a TED Talk, you reach even more. So Richard did a TED Talk on our work, and it's had over 2 million viewers. Well, that's a lot more than an academic paper, right? And it's more than a book or a newspaper article. Film, TV, being able to communicate all of these messages in different ways, that's really, really important. And I think we are starting to see efforts to kind of communicate this kind of message in those ways. But it will take time, and at the moment I think the biggest roadblock are national governments. So I see lots of great action on inequality at local authority level throughout the country, and I see lots of great stuff going on internationally. But at our national government level, not a sausage. And that's the level at which a lot of the important change needs to happen. So things like the Sustainable Development Goal framework, we have to use that. We have to make sure that we hold our government to account for achieving those targets. I don't know. I don't have an answer for you. I think it's like trying to turn the Titanic. I think we all have to do what we can in the spheres that we're good in. I can run some statistics and write certain things, but I can't make a film or write a poem about it. So I can't do huge amounts of campaigning, so we all have to sort of work in different ways. But there is one way that actually all of us can be sort of part of the change we want to see in the world, and that is recognizing that this power of how the relationships between people matter, and being sure that in our own relationships with other people, we don't look down on people. We don't think that some people are worth less than others. We don't think that some people are stupid. We don't think that some people are less deserving, poor, etc. So we can do things ourselves. But I think this will take time. But I do think the tide has shifted. And I'm sorry, that was a really long answer to a quick question. I have been thinking about it for a long, long time.
My question is about automation. So in 25 years' time, it's predicted that half the jobs we have now won't exist. So my question is, how do you think that will affect social mobility, and what do you think we should do in order to mitigate that?
That's an excellent question, and one on which I'm sort of woefully unqualified to answer, but it's obviously a question we have to get to grips with. We've got a rapidly changing world, and what we're likely to see is a world where the kinds of jobs that become available to people get even more sort of divided than they are now, with very high level, highly paid jobs that are to do with controlling all of that automation or doing the cognitive things that robots cannot do. and we'll get some very low-paid service kind of work, the caring sorts of work that robots can't do, and then there won't be sort of much in the middle. I think that what this means is that we really need to think how we feel about full employment and what we feel the working week should look like and what we feel a working lifetime should look like and what kind of occupations we choose to value as a society. I think the processes you're talking about might make a really strong case for a universal basic income. And obviously there are different ways you can construct one of those and fund it. But there's a lot of experiments with that going on at the moment, and I do think those are the kinds of conversations that we need to be having. I was in Scotland last week for a meeting put on by the Scottish government. There's a group of us who are trying to create an alliance of well-being economies to rival the G7, countries that do things differently. And Nicola Sturgeon was talking about how much they're experimenting with universal basic income and considering it for Scottish government policy. So there are, there's real serious discussion about that, and it needs to hurry up because those changes are coming faster than we think.
So whether it is actual political will to do that, because currently we know that the gap is massive.
Yeah, so political will is at the heart of change, right? And how do we get that? The reason we're trying to get this alliance of nations that do things differently together is to provide some leadership and sort of exemplary best practice. So it's not that there's any country in the world where everything's perfect and it's all going well, but there are lots of places where some things are going well. And countries, cities, states are doing things differently, not measuring GDP and using the genuine progress indicator, trying to do things about women's rights differently, or trying to do things about health. And we think if we can create an alliance of nations that say that well-being is their overarching goal rather than economic growth, then maybe we start to get more of that traction. And the alliance that we're building at the moment has got both global north and global south partners in it, all doing things rather differently. So I'm hoping that's going to take off. Thanks.
I'd like to thank you. I've been a social worker for 30 years. And when your book came out, I read your book, it was quite good for me, really, because when some neoliberal manager was blaming the person for their own inequality, poverty, I used to quote your book, which is quite useful, really. But so thanks for that, and that was quite helpful, and I think your book is groundbreaking from that point of view. So the question, what you put, really, I think is really interesting, because the Tories are in power. It's an observation, also a question, really. As people, are they vicious psychopaths who just want to put the boot into the poor, basically? So if Boris Johnson was walking about and he picked somebody off who fell on the floor and happened to be black or working class, would he give him a good kick and put him on the floor again? Are they anti-human? Are they all these things? Greedy, selfish? Some people would say that. But assuming they're human beings, the question therefore is if Keynesianism worked, and actually those at the top of society would gain as well as those at the bottom of society, why don't they actually do it? Why don't the top do it? Because everybody gains. So the question therefore then, I think, potentially from the people at the top of society is, do they believe that economically they can't do this? There's no manoeuvrability. Capitalism in such crisis, and Jeremy Corbyn's put capitalism back on the agenda, that capitalism can't be reformed. So from their point of view, even though they now might want this and see this, they can't actually do it. Now, I'm a shop steward. We had a good discussion in our trade union branch yesterday about a way forward. And the issue is, it seems to me, what the heart of capitalism is exploitation. It's about profit. The 1% gaining off the rest of us. They're in crisis, so is there any wiggle room? And the discussion we had was really good because in our Unison branch, we've recruited some carers from residential care who exploited like hell. And one of them said, the fight we got on pay in Unison is so important because it's not just about pay. Because if Corbyn gets in, which we want, a better redistributed society, then people, even if society can't affect, or they believe the rich are going to be affected, it's going to be bad on them, they're going to put the boot in big time. They did it on Harold Wilson, they did it in Chile, they'll do it again. I think John McDonnell is right. They'll do one on the pound and do everything because they think those at the top might not benefit, and I think they won't benefit, but I don't care that they don't benefit. I don't care a damn. So I think the issues discussing yesterday, I think we need strikes in the public sector over pay. I think we need to be fighting together now. So if they get in, when Corbyn gets in, we support his progressive policies, we have mass mobilisations, we have general strikes. So when they go for it, we say inequality is crap, we want a better society, and don't give us the bullshit. So I really liked your lecture, and you give me hope over the last 10 years. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. One slide I didn't show you all is that solidarity is reduced in more unequal societies. You know, we are divided more from one another. I mean, the general election, which we mentioned before the start, gave me a lot of hope because we saw that with a fairly radical manifesto, not radical enough, but, you know, not bad after what we've seen in recent decades, the public were not dismayed. They were not put off by media representations of this as, you know, a throwback to 1970s, Reds under the bed and all of that worry. I think John McDonnell is right to prepare for the kind of elitist backlash they would get if they formed a government. But I think most elites would not flee. You know, they would probably just get on with it. They'd try and put the boot in, but I think they'd probably just get on with it. And if they flee, that's okay. We might even buy them a ticket. Young people give me hope because of the way young people are viewing politics and getting engaged and discussing issues. And for a long time, youth politics felt to me like it was very issue-oriented. People were very engaged, say, in environmental politics. Now I think it's broadened out again. And I think young people are a huge part of that movement. And the Labour Party, you know, I'm very, very encouraged. The Labour Party are right now preparing their next manifesto, expecting that there will be a general election at some unpredictable time in the not-too-distant future. And they are really reaching out to academics and other people who think a lot about economic and social policy, and they're asking them for input. And that's the first time in my memory that a political party has made a real effort to say, what's the evidence? What works? We want briefings from you. We want ideas for policy. So let's hang in there and see what happens. But thanks for all of your thanks. That was nice.
Thanks. Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. Thanks. I suppose my question has two parts. Like, firstly, you spoke about Labour, and in the UK context, do you think there's a huge amount of difference between Labour policies, taking into account New Labour's policies, maybe not necessarily the current leadership, but do you think there's a huge amount of difference in terms of prospects for change from a Labour government? And secondly, do you see a correlation between voting systems and inequality? Like, for example, here we have first past the post, and do you see countries with proportional representation as having more equality?
There is a slight tendency for more democratic forms of voting to lead to be associated with greater equality. But voting patterns are a bit odd, you know. So like it's not a perfect correlation. We would certainly have a more diverse and interesting discussion on policy if we had a different voting system. Do I think Labour would do things differently? I think they would certainly do things differently to the government we have at the moment. Would they do things differently enough to satisfy me? Probably not, which is why nobody will ever vote me into any kind of political office. Because, you know, when I do that narcissism thing of wanting to rule the world, it's really extreme policies I'd quite like no private education at all, and no, you know, 100% inheritance taxes and things like that. So I don't think we'll ever get the kind of change I would like to see in the world. But I do think they would do things differently. And what we've got at the moment, you know, the austerity economics and the way that we are punishing the poorest in society for the financial crisis which was created by everybody who wasn't them, it's really beyond belief. And it continues to go on. The gentleman before asked, you know, are they all nasty? And, you know, I think the answer is either they're nasty or they're refusing to look at what's being done. So, you know, if we take policies around universal credit and what that is doing to so many families, and we get a question asked in Prime Minister's Question Time yesterday by Jeremy Corbyn, you know, will they stop the rollout of universal credit? And we get the answer from the Prime Minister that, well, we know it's got a few problems, but basically it's okay. So I do think we'd see a difference. Yeah, I do, because it really couldn't be much worse. And as a sort of public health specialist, and I don't know how many of you work in health, we're starting to see that the damage of austerity written on the population's health. So we have infant mortality rising in this country among the poorest, rising. Our life expectancy advances are grinding to a halt. We see mortality going up among the elderly. The suicide rate is going up. You know, we're seeing all of the damage, but we're not yet using it effectively enough to allow our government to sort of not get away with it. You know, still they can stand there in the House of Commons and sort of say, well, it's not great, but we're going to keep doing it anyway. But if they keep on the way they're going, then that mounting evidence of the destruction they're causing, you know, will get too big to ignore.
Oh, good. One of the advantages of being the microphone man. Well, I'm afraid you talked about Brexit before, so I feel I might have to report you to authorities. I just wondered if you had any views on academic freedom of speech in the current climate of fear.
I certainly do. I thought that, I mean, I was shocked by that silly letter, and I thought we should all probably have an I am Spartacus moment, you know, where we all go, I teach about Brexit, I teach about Brexit, I teach about Brexit. Because, you know, anybody who's working at all in the arena of social sciences must be thinking about what this means. Academic freedom is hugely important. I'm happy that my university have been supportive of my right to say what I feel, even when people ring up and complain, you know, and say that academics shouldn't say political things on the radio. They defend me to the hilt, which is a good thing. And it's really important that we do preserve that we are able to point out the consequences of political and policy decision-making and what that does. I think the bigger risk to us as social scientists isn't our academic freedom, it's the undermining of the data collection systems that provide us with the grist to our mill. So if we keep cutting surveys that have provided us with important data on how our society is doing, if we keep cutting those, it'll be more and more difficult for us to demonstrate those changing impacts. So I think that's as important as our freedom to talk about things. Anybody else want a little bit of that adrenaline that comes from speaking in public?
It's just a little something that I've been thinking about over quite a long period of time. And it relates back to your point about how we shouldn't care so much about what other people think about us in a way. So it's just an observation in my little mind. But I'm wondering if part of the system that we have that promotes the government that we have is because the education system that we have that they grow out of. People are inbuilt to not worry about what other people think about them so much. So, because within those circles of the elites who say they don't care if they're not doing that well academically, because their peers are their peers anyway, if you know what I mean. And they're all going forward into brighter futures and so forth. Because when I hear certain politicians speak, I do get the feeling that they don't care what people think of them. And that I could meet them in the street and have a conversation, and then 5 minutes later they could blank me. So I kind of think it's that level of what we might call arrogance that is keeping the system going as well.
I think that's a good point, and it's where confidence slips over into arrogance, and how confidence gets produced in people by the perpetuation of inequality and poverty. If anybody wants to buy a new book this week, I would recommend Diane Ray's, that's R-E-A-Y's new book, which is called Miseducation, and it's all about the influence of class on our educational system. It's excellent. And she really does show how we grow up in different worlds in this country. We are divided from one another. And so it's not only that people at the top may not care, some of them will care more than others, but they don't know. They don't experience life as it's experienced by others in the population. So when you have great inequality, you've got these parallel lives going on, and these parallel trajectories, and these parallel expectations of what life has to offer you and what you can achieve. And that is extremely damaging to our social unity. I think it's as damaging to those at the top as it can be to those at the bottom in terms of the richness of their life's experience. But hey, they get the income. So I think you're absolutely right. And these are processes that start very, very early. But do read Diane Ray's book. It has a lot to say about the role of education. And that's just as important an issue for universities as it is for primary schools and secondary schools.
Thank you very much again. Fantastic talk, and thanks everyone for the questions as well.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks.